Good afternoon, folks. My name is Rob Eyler, and I'm going to be presenting to you today on what's going on in the economy with respect to COVID-19 and some applications for Lassen County. I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for sponsoring this today. And I also want to let you know that if you go to the chat feature here on Zoom, you can type in your questions as we go, and we'll try to answer them at the end as we're going to leave some time. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Our agenda, as I said, is going to start with talking about the cases and where the economy may be going. And then I'm going to talk about California and some potential jobs at risk and really start thinking about, where are the vulnerabilities in the California economy that might lead to a conversation about where the vulnerabilities are in Lassen County. Lassen's a little bit different because of the government presence, but it still is a place where it's going to feel some of the effects. And so we're going to be on sort of job watch and on housing watch, somewhat similar to what happened in the Great Recession. And I'll come back and talk about the context later. But ultimately, folks, it's going to boil right down to the following. How is the social policy going to be lifted? What does it mean on the other side for Lassen County and really for all of California? And then where do we go from here, not only in the current outlook, but really thinking about economic development opportunities to come rather than just reacting? So thinking about the cases, all this started on March 1. And you can see that the total number of cases was lifting up at maybe a slightly increasing rate and then started to flatten out. So we started our social policy early, which was good. Most of our public health officials have said that one of the main reasons why we haven't seen widespread problems and overloading of our health system is exactly as we predicted. We sheltered in place and we are starting to get close to the top of the hill. The problem is that the economy is now going to feel the reverberative impacts and costs of those choices. And that's what we're concerned about. And this is the last 7 days before this week, to just sort of show you it creeping toward the top of the hill. And this is why it's updated every day. There hasn't been a lot of change. It's still just slowly walking toward the flat point. Now, when those cases started to change, a bunch of things happened, but mainly we saw the first effects in our equity markets because the equity markets foresaw two major items. One, the slowdown in consumption was going to lead to job loss, and that potentially those job losses would lead to business losses. So if you look at the way the S&P 500, which is what this shows you, as sort of a broad way of thinking about our equity markets, those are the last two recessions shaded on the graph. And you can see where the Great Recession, the recession in the middle, bottomed out at 735 on the S&P 500 at the end of May 2009, and how it's climbed ever since then to a peak in February of 3277, and then a very sharp drop in March. And that sharp drop in March is because we just had so much uncertainty, and equity markets hate uncertainty, that we saw it drop like a rock, but it came back up at the end of the month and has been creeping up ever since. And you may be thinking, God, what's the equity market know that I don't know? What stock markets are currently betting on is that the policies we put in place to help get people back in their jobs, keep them in their jobs, or to help them have income between now and the time that they would either get back to work or find a new job is all starting to come into place. And what that's going to do for the American economy is potentially shorten the duration of what otherwise would be a deep and long recession if we did nothing. Where we're starting to see some parts of the labor market contract, at least as a way of forecasting forward, is in new initial claims for unemployment insurance. And I'm going to show you quarterly average of the weekly data that come out for both the US and California here through the first couple weeks of April. Here's 1986 forward on a quarterly basis. Here's US unemployment claims after during the last three recessions and beyond. And you can see the hard spike on the right-hand side, the far right-hand side, that's been true for the last 4 weeks. Data just came out this morning that added another 4.4 million people to the roll. And so we're about 27 million people in the last 5 weeks have applied for unemployment insurance who were not previously unemployed, which suggests that the unemployment rate is going to rise very quickly here when the April numbers come out. Now, when you look at California in contrast, the shape of the curve, even though it's a little bit more seasonal, is very similar, and over time has a very, basically follows the national average in terms of where it was with respect to the recessions, but that hard spike is now in California also. And the data for California lagged the national data by about a week, but we're watching both very closely to see not only do they follow each other, but also how dramatic is the difference between California and the US overall. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what's happened is that we've had three policies come when we figured out there were going to be a lot of cases if we did nothing. Three things happened. First two, which are positive, and they didn't come, this is not synchronous in time. they came offset from each other. But fiscal and monetary policy came after the social policy, which is the negative here. But monetary and fiscal policy have now come into play with the idea that there's this huge negative of us staying at home on the economy. Now, while we may be grocery shopping more than we used to, and we may be, let's say, getting takeout food more than we used to, it doesn't mean that every essential business is actually feeling positive effects from this. And it's actually a large miscalculation to believe that that's true. But the key here is that the monetary and fiscal policies that have been passed by the Federal Reserve and Congress respectively are meant to be bigger in scope than the negative aspects of the social policy when it's all said and done. And that's critical, but we need the social policy to fade before we can actually feel those positive effects. And the fiscal effects are really one of the biggest headline grabbers right now. Even though we know interest rates have been pushed down to, again, the so-called zero lower bound, a lot of the headline stuff is the unemployment insurance, the basically direct subsidization of households that have paid taxes by money just simply coming home to those under a certain amount of income, and then the so-called payroll protection plan loans that businesses are potentially receiving. All the combinations of those meant to do is really say, hey, what we're trying to do is keep businesses from making a tough decision about staying in business or not, and thus hopefully keeping people in their jobs now and once the social policy fades. To get a little more detailed on the fiscal policy piece, most of the federal stimulus is around keeping people in their jobs. While we are getting the direct subsidy coming home, most of it's around unemployment insurance and ultimately providing businesses with bridge lending and also kind of a huge tax refund also for making the choice to stay in business. So we've seen eligibility expand. We've seen extensions of eligibility in a bunch of different ways, including so-called pandemic unemployment assistance. And we've also seen the amount we're getting in unemployment rise up and longer time frame. So all kinds of ways in which unemployment insurance has expanded and extended to help everybody who lost their job or may lose their job. One thing about that, though, especially if you're an employer, you may say, wow, now that my former worker is on unemployment because I couldn't retain them, if things turn around, I'd love to rehire them because I think we're going to kind of get back to normal. It may make it tougher for people to be rehired because lower wage workers might be getting paid more on unemployment insurance than they would be at their job based on everything I just told you in terms of the extension of the time in which you can receive it and also the amount that you might receive. So we're going to watch that sort of labor and public economic dynamic come together here in the next, hopefully, 6 months once the social policies are lifted. These business loans I alluded to, I call them loans in terms of air quotes, if you will, because for some, that might turn into a grant if all the conditions of the loan are met with respect to the policy that was passed by Congress, and it'll be like a gigantic tax refund. The issue is actually gaining access to money. So it's now gone in 2 tranches. The first one was spent much more quickly than Congress expected, and they just passed a second one earlier this week. So we will see how fast that one is spent. And if you have applied for those loans and have not received them, the supposition is you will receive them, but there's a lot of people in line. So Congress is trying to sort through the friction between providing and meeting demand and not getting so over the top on these loans that it actually leaves them in a precarious financial position. But it's very tough politically and socially not to, in a sense, satiate demand that's out there. And then finally, the public sector itself is getting a lot of help from the federal government. And in a sense, we're in a kind of a wild fiscal policy time because there's so much that's been spent in such a short amount of time. It's hard to imagine that Congress has gone through all the potential machinations of what the economic implications are. But what it's really trying to do for employers in the private sector and also our state and county and city governments is trying to make sure that they don't make rash decisions and give them the, in a sense, financial padding they need to land softly. Well, a lot of counties and cities are starting to contend with the idea, especially rural California, of whether or not to reopen sooner than later. Well, I've been asked this a lot of times. What are the costs and benefits of reopening maybe a little bit before the state does and doing it maybe in a soft way? Well, in the short term, you might have infection rates go up or reinfect because especially in places as we get into the tourism season, you might see a flow of people coming from other places. Great, you're open, I'm coming. But we don't know if they're going to be infected or not. They may be very, very confident they're not. They may show up and then suddenly they have it. We're sort of playing this self-reporting game in terms of once people start to move around, do they know themselves where they are from a disease standpoint? That's why there's been so much in the news about testing. So part of the short-term cost is where we really don't have a concept yet of how many people out there are potentially still with the disease, may be reinfected, may not be immune to it, all kinds of different disease variations, and we don't want our healthcare systems overloaded. In the medium term, what we don't want to do is shut down again. So let's say we reopen, and then in 3 months we find out that we got reinfected, we're going to have to shut down again. We don't want to do that. In the long term, if that happens, there's all kinds of extensions of costs and issues that come from being shut down, reopening, shutting down again, providing more business uncertainty, providing more worker uncertainty, and trying to turn the corner well. And that's really, folks, the critical factor here. What the state government is trying to do is it's trying to turn the corner in a way that's rational, but recognizing that people have to get back to work. And the rational piece is all disease driven right now. It has almost nothing to do, believe it or not, and as cold-blooded as this sounds, it has nothing to do really with whether or not you're going to keep your job or not, or whether your business is going to stay open. They're very concerned about the healthcare system and the social and almost the socio-political aspects of having the disease run rampant in a way that we weren't willing to control. However, what's teasing them into doing a little bit more of an opening sooner than later is the benefits. We want to get jobs going again, and we want to get spending going again. And for the governments, they have an incentive to get that going because they're losing revenue every day that we're like this, just like our businesses are and our households are. So they get the tax revenue flowing again. In the medium term, we'd be betting that we would not have a repeat of the virus or that a vaccine would come, and we would continue on toward baseline. So in a sense, opening gets us that momentum we need, that if we can beat the virus or do the right thing in terms of social distancing and potentially remaining protected and in many ways operate in a different normal, and we wait for the vaccine to come and get around the corner, assuming one is coming soon, we will get toward baseline much more quickly. And in the long term, and this is the key, once we get going, we're probably going to see all kinds of adaptation and innovation around the new normal. And we should expect that a lot of industries are going to change. But while those change means cost on the front end, there may be some really good things in terms of entrepreneurship on the back. So we're trying to figure out what that looks like. Economists are running rampant trying to answer questions for people along these lines. And public health officers in almost every county in the United States are also wrestling with these questions about how do we balance these forces between the benefits and the costs of actually getting our lives back together again. So folks, it's all about depth and duration. We know we're going to have some pain on the front end. We're trying to keep it from being too deep. We don't want it to be too long in time. And to figure that out, we're watching labor markets very closely. So here are the US and California labor markets since 1976 to show you how other recessions have gone. These are the last 5 recessions in the United States. There's the US and there's California. And notice that California over the last 3 recessions, I think I have these actually outlined, or the last 2 I have outlined, have had a little wider gap between the peak of unemployment in California and the peak of the US economy, and have also had that peak offset a little bit. In other words, the US economy starts to recover short of the so-called dot-com recession, which is the first sort of outlined area here to the left of the Great Recession, which is the high hill at the very far right-hand side. That's where we want to avoid getting too far away from the national picture, but it's likely that California will have unemployment rates that are slightly higher than the US based on our tourism exposure and just the nature of cost shedding that we've been doing in California. And this is where we've been just a little bit. You can see that red line is bumped up just a hair, recognizing that in March, we saw a little bit of a pickup in unemployment at the national level. Now, here is Lassen County with jamming together the the new unemployment insurance claims I talked about earlier and the local unemployment rate. If you look at just the Great Recession, the unemployment insurance claims peaked sometime in the summer of 2010, and then unemployment peaked finally to go down in full about 9 months after that. Now, there was an initial peak that happened basically parallel with unemployment insurance claims peaking, but then there was another peak. So what we're trying to do is get past that peaking situation, which you can see here, right here, there's the peak and here's the peak. Will it take 9 months or not? Well, if we watch the data that come out, and the cool thing about new unemployment insurance claims is that they are point counts of the people that walked into the unemployment office and that live in Lassen County and are receiving unemployment insurance. Those folks are likely to be unemployed. And as they go on those rolls and then hopefully come off of them because they get a job, the unemployment rate goes up, peaks, and falls back down toward growth. And so we're watching that very closely to see what happens. And this here is one way of thinking about how long it might take in Lassen County to recover. So where's the vulnerability in the economy? Well, right now we have declared certain so-called essential businesses that are open and businesses that are relatively close to their customers. Those ones have done okay, including some parts of healthcare, but not all healthcare is working out too well. Let's go to the next one, which is really the biggest impact, and that's on our travel industries. And while Lassen County you'd think is rural enough where airports would not affect it, people who fly into California and visit Lassen County are now not going to be able to do that very easily. And so there's going to be some effect, even in places like Lassen. So what we're concerned about is, as we're going into the tourism season, how many parts of rural California are going to be ultimately affected by the inability of us as Californians to move around, but really the globe to naturally take advantage of the summer in California, and how all parts of California are going to suffer. That's why our urban areas, let's say Orange County. Orange County's got a lot of questions to answer. Even though it's a relatively balanced economy based on its size, it still has a lot of eggs in the basket of tourism around Disneyland and other pieces of that puzzle that are connected either directly or indirectly. We're going to watch those places very closely. Rural California, while not as exposed, certainly has some exposure. Healthcare, while it may seem like, okay, wow, this has got to be a boon for healthcare, right? People are sick and they're coming in. Because we've been so good at shelter in place, the amount of people that would have naturally come in has not been as big a deal. And hence the healthcare system in some ways is sort of lying fallow, waiting for those cases, especially in places that have had very few cases. What we're hearing is some counties actually thinking about, okay, maybe what we should do is go ahead and utilize that space and get people who had scheduled elective surgeries or that want to do some outpatient work, allow them to come back and get actually back in the swing of things on the healthcare side. We will see if that happens over the next 10 or 14 days. There's some rumblings about that in some county offices. We will see. Government is definitely going to be challenged. So while government right now seems like the biggest part of our lives, at some point that will fade, and our state, county, and city governments are ultimately going to have a lot of pressure on them because two things are going to happen. One, revenues are going to fall and costs are going to rise. We're going to have more people asking for social services. We need to watch how that affects our local governments, because our workers are going to be suffering, especially those on the lower side of the wage scale. Our lower wage workers, when they lose their job or lose their income, especially undocumented workers, are going to be seeking relief. And so in California, we are going to see a lot of different demands on social services as we go forward, because even unemployment insurance, as robust as it may not, based on rent and other things, relieve issues like borderline hunger or really the ability to stay in your home. So the social policy, once it lifts, will then, in a sense, unveil a new set of social issues that we've got to try to eclipse. Let's look at two potential forecasts. The first forecast is the tricky one, in the sense that we know we're going to have to feel some pain from this. And we've taken on similar measures to other countries in the world. China's an example of this. The hope is that it's actually going to be in such a way when we come out that the duration of the episode is shorter. We will find that out once we start to lift the social policy, because we're not still out of the woods on that yet. The subsequent recession might be shorter than we would expected, or let's say not as deep, but either way, we should expect losses of jobs or furloughed jobs. And those two together are going to make for some really tricky environments on the other side of this, but not as tricky as the ugly scenario, because there's two aspects to that one. One is that we don't have as good a, say, opening party as we're expecting. There's a lot of people out there who think, or no, actually are claiming politically, that we're going to see a V-shaped recovery and we're going to be back in business in 2 or 3 months. That seems unlikely right now, given the amount of job loss we're expecting. And the American economy, like most economies, does not recover from very sharp losses of jobs and potentially losses of business very quickly, where the job losses are something we need to watch very closely with respect to losing capacity to produce income in our economy. So the ugly scenario not only has that part of it, a slow coming out party, but the second part that it has is actually losing the ability to get around the corner in the winter without a repeat. If we have a repeat episode of COVID-19 come back in the fall, in the early winter, we're going to potentially have to shelter in place again, which is going to reactuate the social policies. Let's look at the scenario here. This is the baseline movement in California that we first expected by a California Department of Finance gave to the governor's office. And I'm on the group that actually does that. I'm very humbled that they ask me back every year to talk about what my thoughts are on this forecast. And in the early part of 2020, this is what we foresaw as far as through the end of 2023. Now, the tricky scenario is this one, where we see the sharp decline in jobs very soon, April, May, June, and then we start to have a recovery, which should happen relatively quickly, at least in terms of the recovery starting. But whether or not it continues to go forward at this pace is an open question. This is the current forecast on the tricky side. On the ugly side, and this is critical, this second part here, which is the repeat performance, hits the California economy again and hits it hard to where it bottoms out a second time. So if the ugly scenario happens, we're going to be very concerned that the duration has now elongated and the depth has gotten deeper, and we're trying to avoid both. That's why I gave you that slide that said depth and duration. And there's the last two recessions in terms of giving you some contrast. This is the Great Recession in terms of what happened with jobs there. And you can see it's much more smooth in terms of the movements, but we're expecting a serious change in jobs right here versus the Great Recession was just a slow moving beast, taking jobs away month after month after month on a very slow but deepening pace. This is where we're going to be, folks. We're in that ugly scenario. We're back at 2015 numbers, so we will lose potentially 5 years of jobs growth if we have the ugly scenario as I predicted. It may not be this ugly, and we're hoping it's not, but even 2 or 3 years of job loss can be a major problem. Here's Lassen County. So in Lassen County, you can see a couple things. Very similar movement to the state of California in terms of job loss. But the tricky scenario and the ugly scenario are a little closer to each other in terms of the front end because of the government sector remaining relatively stable probably in Lassen County. So where Lassen County has a little bit of relief is based on the prison being there and having that government presence that's relatively large. But notice that if there is a repeat, the space between the tricky scenario, which is the blue, and the ugly scenario, which is the red, widens and then starts to come a little bit more together, where we're really back at baseline on the tricky side in early 2022, but it's going to take until 2023 if we have the ugly scenario, even for Lassen County. But the depth of the problem is probably somewhat muted because of the jobs mix in Lassen County versus other parts of California. There's the recessions to give you some perspective. Obviously, you can see the Great Recession and how hard that was on Lassen County. But now let's talk about what we can do from an economic development standpoint. So assuming that we know, in a sense, what's going to happen, then can we do some triage around it where we can say, okay, let's plan now. Tourism's a big deal. We want to think about what are we going to do about our downtowns and really about the flow of visitors if, in fact, we get the relief we're expecting from social policy. How are we going to engage those strategies in a relatively competitive marketplace? And our downtowns have a second element to them, which is our local retailers and our local merchants. We don't want to lose those businesses and lose the flavor of our downtowns, but this situation has threatened that greatly. We're concerned about construction. Construction has been a way that we've sort of bolstered through out of the last few recessions. Will we have construction momentum on the other side of this? And furthermore, will that lack of construction momentum, if it happens, lead to a housing price downturn that's similar to the Great Recession? I get that question a lot, and I don't see that happening in terms of housing prices contracting very quickly, but we're watching that also very closely. And whether or not the prison has this sort of broader economic impact positively on Lassen in terms of acting as that sort of central rock for the county, or if we start to see the prison system somewhat evolve in a way that actually threatens that rock. And so Lassen County should also be thinking about economic diversification strategies, if not for its own betterment, but just thinking about that it cannot have that one economic driver as the core forever. This is one of those crises where there might be opportunity to think about that. On the sales tax side, a lot of rural California kind of has this balancing act between tourism and some other industry, but tourism is usually some part of it. In other words, we do rely on taxable sales on the retail and restaurant side. And this graph shows you that the movement of taxable sales for retail and restaurants, the most risky, where the largest risk exposure is in terms of taxable sales for the municipality in this episode, moves basically along with California, more or less a little bit more of importance, let's say, to total taxable sales than the state on average. Housing market data suggests that Lassen County has seen some pretty decent movement the last couple of years. Notice that California has moved also up the last couple of years, but that since the bottom, we've seen gains across the board. We don't want to lose these wealth gains if we can help it. It's absolutely critical that we don't lose these wealth gains based on this episode. But of course, we may not have much of a choice in that by the nature of how the economy is going to evolve, and our wealth can help us bridge the gap over times in which we lose our jobs. If a lot of people lose their jobs and unemployment has a long duration, it's going to be very tough for people to stay in their homes, no matter what policy is allowing banks to do and ostensibly subsidizing against that household, that homeowner's choice. But we will see. This is kind of how we're starting the year, and ultimately since the bottom, since 2010, what has happened. On the municipal side, just to wrap up on that piece, taxable sales we should expect to fall. There's no reason to expect that taxable sales are not going to fall in this year, short of a miraculous change once the social policy is lifted. TOT is going to be another part of that. If you're a place where you have hotels or even motels or B&Bs, you're going to see TOT very much contracting as we speak. Will construction slow down? Will property taxes fall? Will we see an additional cost in social assistance side rise in such a way that public safety has become more of an issue? In our urban areas, we're expecting that. In our more rural areas of California, we're actually expecting more on the social assistance side than, let's say, the public safety side, but we should expect municipal costs to rise. And then finally, we're worried about unfunded liabilities and the movement of people from their current situation in jobs and government into retirement. Will we see golden handshakes come out as a way of minimizing costs over time? And will we actually see change in that sense that changes the economic dynamics of places like Lassen County that have a relatively large footprint in government? That's a big question. I'm a public employee with my day job, and we're concerned about what we're going to have in terms of flexibility in hiring and the number of workers that are going to stick around or go into CalPERS. And CalPERS itself is going to have some issues that might lead to some shocks. We will see. But all that has dynamics for government coming up that we haven't fully seen yet because we just don't know yet until the social policy is lifted. So what are we watching going forward, and what are some things to think about? Well, the labor market changes are a big deal. I started with this, I'm going to end with this. We're watching jobs very closely. And we think we got about 2.8 million people in California now that are currently lining up and waiting for unemployment checks to show up at home. That's a lot of people given our current workforce. So we're thinking that unemployment rate for California in April is probably going to end up somewhere in the high teens or low 20s. It might get that high, we will see. But it's basically following the US average. We're also watching to see is if economic development is happening correctly, then we should start to see job openings for people that, or for businesses that are thinking about, okay, when we see social policy lifting, I'm gonna have to rehire, and I need to get ready for that and see how many people are actually unemployed when it's all said and done, or actually kept their job, whichever way you wanna look at the labor market. The number of hours that are worked is another thing to watch, and seeing where you can see a downturn in industries. And it really is at the US level. You see that by the time we get it in California, it's gonna be a little late for that at the industrial level. But we've seen hospitality jobs shrink very rapidly, which we knew was going to happen, but the data now corroborate that industry is shrinking quickly. Another piece of data to think about, National Restaurant Association said last week that 110,000 restaurants, which is about 10% of their restaurants that are in that association in the United States, have now closed. So it's, and not closed just for now, but actually permanently shuttered. So that's something to think about in terms of the capacity of the economy on the other side of this, and the number of hours that actually people are going to work if the business isn't there anymore. That's what's so critical about keeping businesses in business. The summer, if you think about Lassen County and what's coming, how the summer goes is going to dictate a lot. So we're hoping the tourism season has some positive sort of, kind of strangely positive benefits for rural California, because people cannot get on planes and travel everywhere based on restrictions on air travel or the cost of going to travel some other places in the world because of what you got to do to get on a plane, or just the not wanting to risk getting infected by going overseas. We will see if that doesn't have a good effect on rural California in the summer. And epidemiology wise, the cases are going to drive everything. Epidemiologists have now become among the most watched scientists on planet Earth, and probably will be for some time, because there's so much now popularity in watching the evolution of these cases. But those cases are going to ultimately dictate the duration and the depth of this episode, because they're dictating social policy. And that's really the key. The policy, even though fiscal and monetary have come together, the social policies are critical to being not only the reason why we're in this situation in saving lives, but also our ability to get out of it economically while those lives were saved. If we can link those two together, 3 or 4 years from now, we're going to see this as a time in which something hit us like a natural disaster and really upended our economy, but we came out at okay and may have some really good entrepreneurship on the other side. So with that, I'm hoping that we have some questions. Again, I want to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me today. And Vicki, if you are there, please let me know and we can start questions.
I am here. First question, with our reliance on government jobs, when will we see job losses, and what can local governments do to preserve those jobs?
It's a great question. You should see job losses immediately. You probably, if you left your house, which you may not be doing based on policy, which is good, you probably see it right away. One of the things that's been tricky is that in this episode thus far versus the Great Recession episode, our staying at home is not making the changes as visual as you may have seen then in 2008, 9, and 10. But local government's going to struggle with this a little bit in the sense that they know that their coffers are going to contract. So the best thing local government can do is try to provide as many resources to support the reclamation of our economic lives, either for the worker or the business, and put those resources in front of residents and businesses to try to get everybody as much relief as they can based on what the federal government is doing. But also, in a sense, if there's lenders out there that are providing good lending, credit unions, for example, have been way out in front of this in terms of providing relief for their members and for their member businesses. Just got to get out there and really try to provide as many resources as you can for people to just bridge over the troubled water. If we can get to the point where the social policies are lifted, local governments won't have to react in a monetary way necessarily to help their communities. They can do it in ways by assembling all the resources possible and making partnerships where residents and businesses can gain access to those resources and really get onto a better tomorrow. That's on the residential side mainly. On the business side, there are tax holidays that can happen and ways you can give businesses some relief, but cities and counties are going to find a lot of pressure on the municipal side for their own budgets, to where by doing that now might hurt them later, and there's going to be a lot of consternation about doing an enormous amount of that.
Okay. Do you think there will be a deeper slide this time after the initial gains like we saw in the last two recessions?
I don't think so. It seems like, at least what the very paltry amount of data we have thus far are telling us, and what we think should be true given the momentum going into this, that the recovery won't be as nasty as the recovery out of the Great Recession. But that kind of depends on where you are and who you are. If your business was able to remain open and you're able to turn the corner well, and you're able to take advantage of a lot of these other programs that are going on, you might come out of this actually relatively easy. Other businesses, especially restaurants, I think restaurants are the ones that are really going to be the most hurt, especially those that don't have easy takeout options or see themselves as not being able business-wise to conform to what are likely coming as social conditions as we gather. We're going to see a lot of restaurants that we like no longer there, unfortunately. So that's where the really nasty part of this is probably going to come, and is in reshaping our, let's say, local lives around our local businesses.
Okay. In the short and the medium terms, what can small businesses do to sustain themselves?
Best thing to do is plan. One of the things we saw in the Great Recession is that businesses did not have a plan. And if you have been in a fire-affected area or affected area in the last few years, business resiliency has come out of those fires as a big topic for all businesses. So if you have a plan, even you don't have to have a strategic plan, you don't have to have a folder sitting on your bookshelf that says, okay, we printed out 200 pages of stuff, we're ready to go. You can just have in your mind, what have you got to do? What are the steps between now and a big decision for you that you've got to make to see if you can actually sustain yourself through this issue and come out on the other side? And what are you going to do on the other side? And it can be just very straightforward, but talk to your banker, talk to your workers, talk to your partners, talk to your spouses and partners at home, and really think about what can you actually sustain. That's critical to get through this as a plan. I think if you don't plan and you're just constantly reacting, those are the businesses going to very much suffer in this.
Okay. What do you think would be the unemployment rate if the federal government did not implement the PPP, the Payroll Protection Plan?
That's a great question. I think it would probably be not an enormous amount higher, maybe in the mid-20s, but a lot of that is betting on the idea that these folks that are in businesses that get the PPP plan will stay in their jobs after the grant is made. So one of the things to watch for is that the Payroll Protection Plan will leave businesses in kind of a weird decision process after the 30th of June, generally, where this converts into a grant. And once that grant is made, the conditions under which you have to continue to keep your workers are still somewhat foggy. So it's possible we will have an initial round of unemployment that is somewhat muted once everything is said and done. And then we will see another one come late summer, because businesses who thought they could actually get through the summer find out that they could not do so based on the hurt during this process. and end up either going out of business or laying people off in early fall. That's something we're hoping is avoided by a good turn back on of the economy. And that's why there's a lot of friction coming out of the White House to just get the thing started again, because they know that scenario is possible, as well as they know a repeat of this in the fall and the winter in terms of COVID-19 coming back and potentially even stronger is starting to mount up as a scientific possibility. So the hope is that what PPP does is get us to the point where our economy can see the light in terms of getting back to more regularity, and everybody can keep their job in the interim period.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Eyler. And I'd like to thank the Alliance for Workforce Development as well for sponsoring this webinar. Those of you who may want to share this, we will have the recorded version will be on the AFWD website possibly later today, or at least by tomorrow. And I encourage you to share that with your elected officials and other businesses. Thank you again, Dr. Eyler, and thank everyone who has attended. Appreciate it.
Thanks, folks. Take care. Thanks, Vicki.